From the cracked concrete of his backyard to the polished strips of national arenas, David's journey was forged in sweat, defiance, and a relentless will to belong. A scholarship to the elite Blackwood Fencing Academy should have been his ticket to a better future, but instead placed him under the harsh glare of privilege, prejudice, and rivalry. Outmatched in gear, status, and experience, he faced opponents who saw him as an intruder in their gentleman's sport, none more dangerous than Julian, the Academy's golden boy. Yet with every taunt, every loss, and every grueling lesson, David's raw instinct evolved into disciplined artistry, his isolation into unshakable focus. What began as a fight for self-respect would grow into a battle for something far greater, the honor of carrying his nation's colors onto the world stage. If you liked the video and subscribe to the channel, let's move on to our story. Enjoy watching. The smell was the first thing that hit David. It wasn't the familiar scent of cut grass and damp earth from his own backyard, where he'd spent countless hours lunging at a tennis ball dangling from a clothesline. This was different. It was a sterile, sharp smell of sweat, steel, and something else, something that smelled like money. The Blackwood Fencing Academy was less a gym and more a shrine to a sport he'd only ever seen on television. The polished wooden floors gleamed under recessed lighting, and the walls were lined with photos of fencers, all of them white, holding trophies that shone almost as brightly as the floor. At 12 years old, David was acutely aware of how much he stood out. It wasn't just the color of his skin, a deep, rich brown that seemed to absorb the artificial light of the academy. It was everything else. His t-shirt was a faded hand-me-down, a stark contrast to the crisp, white uniforms of the other kids. His sneakers, though clean, were worn at the soles, a testament to the miles he'd run on cracked pavement, not polished wood. And his fencing gear, a hodgepodge of second-hand equipment secured by the scholarship that had brought him here, felt foreign and heavy in his hands. He had been discovered by Coach Du Bois, a man whose reputation was as sharp as the foils he taught his students to wield. The coach had been driving through David's neighborhood, a shortcut he rarely took, when he saw him. A boy, all wiry limbs and fierce concentration, practicing his footwork in a patch of uneven grass, a makeshift foil, a car antenna with a taped handle, in his hand. Du Bois had seen something in that raw, untamed energy. He saw a diamond in the rough, a fencer in the making. The scholarship had felt like a golden ticket, a way out, a way up. But now, standing in the hallowed halls of the Blackwood Fencing Academy, it felt more like a spotlight highlighting all the ways he didn't belong. The other fencers, a clique of boys who moved with the easy confidence of those who had never known want, were watching him. They weren't trying to be subtle about it. Their whispers were like the buzz of angry hornets, their stares like tiny pinpricks on his skin. At the center of the group was Julian, a boy with a mane of blonde hair and a sneer that seemed to be a permanent fixture on his face. He was the Academy's golden boy, the reigning junior champion, the son of a man whose name was emblazoned on a plaque on the wall. Julian was the sun around which the other boys orbited, and his light was not a warm one. "Look what the cat dragged in," Julian said, his voice loud enough to carry across the room. "Did you get lost on your way to the basketball court?" The other boys snickered. David's grip tightened on his foil. He wanted to say something, to fire back a retort as sharp as their blades, but the words caught in his throat. He had been taught to be respectful, to let his actions speak for him. But here, in this temple of privilege, his silence felt like a confession of his otherness. Coach Du Bois, a man with a hawk-like face and eyes that missed nothing, clapped his hands, the sound echoing through the cavernous room. "All right, enough chatter. On the line. Warm-ups." The boys, including Julian, snapped to attention, their casual cruelty replaced by a disciplined focus. David found a spot at the end of the line, trying to mimic the movements of the others, his body feeling clumsy and out of sync. The warm-ups were a series of lunges, parries, and footwork drills that were far more complex than the simple exercises he had practiced in his backyard. He stumbled, his feet tangling, his foil feeling like a lead weight in his hand. The snickers returned, quieter this time but no less cutting. David's face burned with a mixture of shame and anger. He was a good athlete. He was strong, he was fast, and he had a natural sense of timing. But here, surrounded by the polished precision of the other fencers, he felt like a fraud. Coach Du Bois walked down the line, his critical gaze sweeping over each fencer. He paused in front of David, his expression unreadable. "Your footwork is sloppy, your parry is too wide, and you're holding your foil like a baseball bat." "But," he tapped David's chest with a gloved finger, "you have the heart of a fighter. We can work with that." The coach's words were a double-edged sword. They were a validation of his potential, But they also set him apart, marking him as a project, a charity case. The other boys who received only curt nods or sharp corrections from the coach now had another reason to resent him. The practice continued with a series of one-on-one sparring sessions. David was paired with a boy named Thomas, one of Julian's closest friends. Thomas was all grace and precision, his movements a textbook example of classical fencing. David, on the other hand, was all instinct and raw power. He was unorthodox, his lunges too deep, his parries too aggressive. But he was also unpredictable. He lost the first point, then the second. The other boys were watching, their smirks growing with each point Thomas scored. But David wasn't defeated. He was learning. He was adapting. He was watching Thomas, seeing the patterns in his attacks, the slight hesitation before his riposte. On the third point, as Thomas lunged, David did something unexpected. Instead of a standard parry, he used a move he had developed in his backyard, a sweeping, circular block that knocked Thomas's foil wide. In that split second of surprise, David lunged, his foil tapping Thomas's chest with a satisfying thud. A collective gasp went through the room. Thomas stared at him, his mouth agape. Even Coach Dubois raised an eyebrow. David had scored a point. It was just 1 point in one practice, but it was a start. The final sparring session of the day was against Julian. It was an unofficial match, a friendly bout, but the tension in the room was palpable. This was a test, a challenge, a declaration of war. Julian was a blur of white, his movements fluid and precise. He was a beautiful fencer, a dancer with a blade. He scored the first point with an elegant flesh, his foil a silver streak that seemed to appear out of nowhere. The second point followed quickly, a disengage and riposte that left David feeling slow and clumsy. But David was not intimidated. He had faced bigger challenges than a boy with a silver spoon in his mouth and a foil in his hand. He had faced the gnawing hunger of an empty stomach, the sting of prejudice in a world that judged him before he even opened his mouth. On the third point, Julian, confident in his superiority, became careless. He lunged, a powerful, aggressive move designed to overwhelm David. But David was ready. He remembered the move he had used against Thomas, the unorthodox block that had created an opening. He executed it perfectly, the sound of steel on steel ringing through the silent room. Julian's foil was knocked aside, his body overextended, his balance compromised. And in that moment, David saw his chance. He lunged, not with the polished grace of a Blackwood fencer, but with the raw, untamed power of a boy who had nothing to lose and everything to gain. His foil hit Julian's chest, the tip depressing, the light on the scoring machine flashing. Silence. Then a slow single clap from Coach Dubois. Julian stared at David, his blue eyes wide with disbelief and fury. He had been touched, scored upon by the charity case, the boy from the wrong side of the tracks. He had been beaten, if only for a moment, and his world, a world built on the certainty of his own superiority, had been shaken. David stood his ground, his heart pounding in his chest, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He was an outsider, a pariah, a boy who didn't belong. But in that moment, with the light of the scoring machine reflecting in his dark eyes, he felt a spark of something he hadn't felt before. Was hope. The silence that followed the flashing light was heavier than any sound. It pressed in on David, thick and suffocating. Julian ripped his mask off, his face a thunderous canvas of shock and rage. The single point of contact, a small, fleeting touch, had shattered his composure completely. He didn't say a word. He simply turned, his back ramrod straight, and stalked towards the changing rooms, leaving a wake of stunned fencers behind him. The spell was broken. The other boys, Julian's loyal satellites, immediately coalesced into a murmuring group, their eyes darting towards David like wasps. The whispers started again, this time laced with a venom that was sharper than before. Fluke. Lucky shot. He fights like a street brawler, not a fencer. David stood alone on the strip, the adrenaline slowly draining away, replaced by a cold, isolating awareness of their hostility. He had won the point, but he had lost any chance of acceptance. He had drawn a line in the polished wood, and he was on one side and they were all on the other. Coach Dubois's slow clap had been the only sound of approval, but he offered no further praise. "That's enough for today," he announced, his voice cutting through the whispers. "Hit the showers." David, a word. David's heart hammered against his ribs. He followed the coach to his small, cluttered office, a room that smelled of old leather and metal polish. Trophies and medals from a bygone era crowded every surface, dull with a fine layer of dust. Du Bois didn't ask him to sit. He leaned against his desk, arms crossed, his hawk-like eyes scrutinizing David from head to toe. "You got lucky," the coach said, his tone flat. "That move was sloppy. A circus trick. Against a focused opponent, you would have been skewered." David's brief flicker of pride was extinguished. "But it worked," he mumbled, his gaze fixed on a tarnished silver cup. "It worked once," Du Bois corrected him. "Because he underestimated you. He was arrogant and you capitalized on it. Do not mistake a lucky break for a strategy. Raw talent will only get you so far, boy. It's a foundation, but without discipline, without technique, it's just a house of cards waiting for a breeze. You have the fire, I'll give you that. But fire is useless if you can't control it. It just burns itself out." He pushed a book across the desk towards David. It was an old leather-bound volume, the title in French faded but still legible, L'Art d'Armes. The Art of Arms. "Read it," Du Bois commanded. "Memorize it. Understand it. Your instincts are a gift, but they are wild. They need to be tamed, honed by the knowledge of those who came before you. Your training is not just here in this academy. It is every waking moment. When you walk, you will think of your footwork. When you eat, you will think of your posture. When you sleep, you will dream of the perfect parry. Do you understand?" "Yes, coach," David said, his voice barely a whisper. He took the book. It felt heavy in his hands, heavy with the weight of history and expectation. The days that followed blurred into a grueling routine. Mornings were spent at the academy, a relentless cycle of drills, conditioning, and sparring. David was a ghost in the gleaming halls of Blackwood. The other boys ignored him, a silent, collective shunning that was more unnerving than their open taunts. He ate his lunch alone, read the French fencing manual in a quiet corner, and endured the sparring sessions where his opponents came at him with a controlled fury, determined to put the street brawler in his place. He absorbed every lesson, every correction from Coach Du Bois, like a man dying of thirst. He was pushed harder than anyone else. While the other boys worked on refining their already polished techniques, Du Bois was breaking David down and rebuilding him from the ground up. He spent hours in front of a full-length mirror, practicing his en-garde stance until his muscles screamed in protest. He was a ghost in the mirror too, a solitary figure endlessly repeating the same movements, striving for the effortless grace that seemed to come so naturally to the others. His evenings were no different. After the long bus ride home, he wouldn't rest. He would recreate the academy in his own world. The cracked concrete of his backyard became the fencing strip. The dangling tennis ball was his opponent, a tireless, unjudging partner. He would practice the footwork from the book, the lunges, the advances, the retreats, his worn sneakers scuffing patterns in the dirt. He was driven by a desperate, burning need to prove them all wrong. To prove Coach Du Bois right. One afternoon, as he was practicing a complex disengage he'd been struggling with, Julian and Thomas appeared at the edge of his yard, leaning against the chain-link fence that separated his world from theirs. They had clearly gone out of their way to come here, to invade his sanctuary. "Still playing with your toys?" Julian called out, his voice dripping with condescension. He gestured towards the car antenna foil that David still kept, a relic from his old life. "You can put on the fancy uniform, but you can't wash the gutter off you, can you?" David stopped, his breath catching in his chest. He stood his ground, his makeshift foil in one hand, the academy issued one in the other. He said nothing. "My father says the scholarship was a mistake," Julian continued, his sneer widening. "A waste of resources. He says you lack the breeding for a gentleman's sport. You're all brute force. No finesse. No artistry." Every word was a carefully aimed thrust, designed to find the chinks in his armor. David's hand tightened on the hilt of his foil. He could feel the familiar anger rising hot and wild. It was the fire Coach Du Bois had warned him about. He took a deep breath, the coach's words echoing in his mind. Control it. Own it. Instead of rising to the bait, David turned his back on them. He faced the dangling tennis ball and raised his foil. He ignored their taunts, their laughter, and focused on the image in his mind. The diagram in the book, the ghost in the mirror, the controlled, precise movement he had been practicing for hours. He advanced, his footwork crisp and measured. He feinted left, then right. He saw the opening, the tiny window of opportunity. He lunged. It wasn't the wild, overextended lunge of his first day. It was controlled, explosive, every muscle working in perfect harmony. The tip of his foil struck the tennis ball dead center, the thwack of the impact sharp and clean. He held the lunge for a perfect, suspended moment, his body a study in disciplined power. Then he recovered, his form flawless. He didn't look back at Julian or Thomas. He didn't need to. The sudden silence from behind the fence was more satisfying than any comeback he could have ever uttered. He had answered their words not with anger, but with action, with technique, with art. As he prepared for his next drill, he felt a subtle shift inside him. The shame and anger were still there, simmering beneath the surface. But now they were mixed with something else. A cold, hard resolve. He wasn't just a boy with a chip on his shoulder anymore. He was a fencer. And he was just getting started. The announcement of the Northwood Regional Open Tournament sent a ripple of excitement through the academy. For Julian and his cohort, it was a routine event, another opportunity to collect medals and reaffirm their dominance. For David, it was a terrifying precipice. Coach Dubois had signed him up without a word of consultation, simply posting the roster on the bulletin board. David's name was at the bottom of the list, an afterthought in stark black ink. The message was clear. This was not an opportunity, it was a test. A crucible. The weeks leading up to the tournament were an intensification of his solitary training. The ghost in the mirror became his only confidant, his reflection the only partner that didn't sneer or whisper behind his back. He devoured l'art d'armes, the French text slowly yielding its secrets to him through sheer, relentless effort. He felt the technique seeping into his muscle memory, the wild, raw energy that had defined him being channeled into something more refined, more lethal. He was no longer just a fighter. He was becoming a weapon. This transformation did not go unnoticed. His newfound precision on the practice strip was a source of constant, simmering resentment for the other boys. They could no longer dismiss him as a street brawler. His parries were clean, his footwork was economical, and his attacks, when they came, were launched from a foundation of solid technique. They couldn't beat him as easily anymore, and every point he scored against them was a fresh insult, a violation of the established order. Julian, in particular, watched him with a cold, analytical fury, his eyes promising a reckoning. The day of the tournament arrived, a crisp autumn Saturday. The venue was a university gymnasium, larger and more impersonal than the academy. It was a chaotic symphony of buzzing scoring machines, clashing steel, and the shouts of fencers and coaches. David felt a knot of anxiety tighten in his stomach. He was an island in the sea of white uniforms, the sole representative of Blackwood without a parent or a friend in the stands. Coach Dubois gave him a curt nod, his only instruction a gruff, "Don't disappoint me." His first bout was against a boy he'd never seen before, a lanky fencer with a nervous twitch. The formal command, "En garde, prêts allez," echoed in the vast space, and for a moment David froze. The hours in the backyard, the ghost in the mirror, they all seemed a world away. He lost the first 2 points in a clumsy daze, his movements stiff and uncertain. The old panic, the feeling of not belonging, threatened to overwhelm him. Then he looked past his opponent and saw Julian and Thomas watching from the sidelines, their expressions smug. A switch flipped inside him. The fire, the one Coach Dubois had warned him about, roared to life. But this time it didn't burn wild. It was a controlled burn, channeled through the discipline he had so painfully acquired. He took a deep breath, settled into his stance, and began to fence. He won the next 5 points in quick succession, his movements a blur of controlled aggression. He won the bout 5-2. He didn't feel elation, only a grim sense of relief. He moved through the preliminary rounds, a silent, focused machine. He defeated opponent after opponent, his fencing a testament to his grueling training. He wasn't flashy, he wasn't unorthodox. He was simply efficient, his actions stripped of any wasted motion. With each victory, the whispers in the crowd grew. "Who is that kid? The one from Blackwood? I thought Julian was their star." Inevitably, the bracket pitted him against one of his own, Thomas. As they saluted, the air between them crackled with animosity. This was more than just a tournament bout. This was a continuation of the war that had been waged in the silence and whispers of the academy. Thomas came at him with a ferocity born of desperation, his attacks sharp and aggressive. He was fighting for his pride, for his place in Julian's inner circle. But David was a different fencer now. He met Thomas's aggression not with wild instinct, but with the cool, calculated techniques from the book. He used a textbook parry riposte to score the first touch. He controlled the distance, his footwork flawless, forcing Thomas into making mistakes. He saw the frustration mounting in his opponent's eyes, the polished technique beginning to crumble under the pressure. The final touch was an elegant counterattack, a move straight from the pages of L'Art d'Armes. David had won 5-3. He offered his hand to Thomas, a gesture of sportsmanship. Thomas slapped it away, his face contorted with humiliation, and stormed off the strip. Across the gymnasium, David met Julian's gaze. There was no surprise in the blond boy's eyes. Only pure, unadulterated hatred. David had not only beaten his friend, he had beaten him at his own game. He had proven he was not a fluke. He was a contender. As he walked back to the waiting area, a few fencers from other clubs nodded at him, a small but significant gesture of respect. He had earned a place in their world. But as he sat down, alone, the weight of his victory settled upon him. He had climbed another rung on the ladder, but in doing so, he had only moved further away from the boys he trained with every day. He was a source of grudging admiration for strangers, but a source of pure animosity for his own teammates. The path he was on was a lonely one, and he knew with chilling certainty that it was leading directly to Julian. The path to the final was a blur of focused intensity. David's semi-final opponent was a tall, rangy fencer from a rival academy, whose long reach had been his weapon throughout the tournament. For the first few points, David struggled to close the distance, the tip of his opponent's foil keeping him at bay, scoring 2 quick touches. The crowd, now invested in the underdog narrative, murmured with concern. On the sideline, Coach Dubois stood like a statue, his face impassive, offering no guidance. He was leaving David to solve this puzzle on his own. And David did. He remembered a section in L'Art d'Armes on infighting, the art of collapsing the distance and forcing the fight into close quarters. It was risky, requiring precise timing and explosive speed. Taking a deep breath, he changed his rhythm. Instead of trying to fence at range, he waited for the lanky fencer to commit to an attack, and then in a burst of motion he exploded forward, ducking under the outstretched arm. He was inside his opponent's guard, too close for the boy's long blade to be effective. A quick, upward thrust to the chest, and the light flashed in his favor. He repeated the tactic twice more, his confidence surging with each successful point. The tall fencer, his primary advantage neutralized, became flustered. His attacks grew wild, his footwork sloppy. David picked him apart with cool efficiency, winning the bout 5-3. He had earned his place in the final. His opponent would be Julian. The gymnasium buzzed with an electric tension. This was the final everyone had been waiting for, a classic David and Goliath story, though in this version, Goliath was the one with the perfect form and the pedigree. The Blackwood fencers stood in a tight, hostile knot behind Julian, a silent wall of support for their fallen king. David stood alone, the space around him a palpable void. He saw Coach Dubois approaching, and for a moment he hoped for a word of encouragement, a piece of strategy. The coach stopped a few feet away. "He's a textbook fencer," Dubois said, his voice low. "He will expect you to fight from the book. Don't." And with that, he turned and walked back to his observation post. The cryptic advice hung in the air, a riddle David had to solve in the heat of battle. Don't fight from the book? The book was all he had. The referee's call brought them to the center of the strip. En garde. They raised their foils, the metal gleaming under the gymnasium lights. As David looked into Julian's eyes through the mesh of his mask, he saw no fear, no uncertainty. Only a cold, burning rage. This wasn't a sport for Julian anymore. It was a matter of honor, of restoring a world that David had dared to disrupt. Pretz Alice. The first point was a masterclass from Julian. He was a whirlwind of controlled motion, his blade a silver blur. A feint, a disengage, a lightning-fast lunge. The point was his before David could even process the attack. 1-0, the Blackwood contingent cheered. David reset, his mind racing. Don't fight from the book. What did it mean? He couldn't abandon his technique, the foundation he had so painstakingly built. Maybe it meant not being predictable. He had to be the ghost in the mirror, but a ghost Julian couldn't anticipate. On the second point, he let Julian take the offensive again. But this time David didn't just parry. He used a yielding parry, absorbing the force of Julian's attack and redirecting it, making Julian overextend. In that brief moment of imbalance, David's riposte was swift and true. 1-1. The crowd roared its approval. The bout became a fierce, psychological chess match. Each fencer tested the other, looking for a weakness, a crack in the facade. Julian was technically flawless, his every move a picture of perfection. But David was relentless, his defense unbreakable, his unorthodox mind always a step ahead. He was using the techniques from the book, but with his own instinctive flair, a rhythm that was all his own. He was a jazz musician riffing on a classical theme. The score crept upwards, point for agonizing point. 2-1 for Julian. 2-2. 3-2 for David. 3-3. Julian's frustration began to show. His attacks became more forceful, his movements edged with a barely concealed anger. He tried to intimidate David, his blade clashing hard against his, a fencer's version of a playground shove. But David remained centered, his expression unreadable behind his mask. He was a rock, and Julian's rage was a wave crashing against him, receding with nothing to show for its fury. At 4-4, the gymnasium was silent. It all came down to this. The final point. The referee's call echoed in the stillness. Alice. Julian came at him with everything he had, a desperate, furious onslaught. He lunged, a powerful, driving attack designed to overwhelm David, to pin him to the back line. David retreated, his footwork precise, giving ground but not breaking. He parried the first thrust, then the second. He was being pushed, the end of the strip looming behind him. Then he saw it. In his rage, Julian had forgotten the first rule of fencing: never sacrifice form for power. His final, desperate lunge was a fraction too deep, his body weight too far forward. It was the same mistake he had made in practice. That first day David had scored a point against him. Don't fight from the book. In a split second, David knew what he had to do. The book would tell him to parry and riposte, a classic, safe response. But his instincts, the wild, untamed part of him that Du Bois had sought to control, screamed for something else. He did something no textbook would ever advise. Instead of parrying, he dropped his body low, the foil tip almost scraping the floor, and executed a move of his own invention, a sweeping, upward thrust that came from an impossible angle. It was the street brawler and the artist combined, a move born of backyard practice and academy discipline. Julian's blade sailed over David's shoulder, finding only empty air. He was completely exposed. David's foil, rising from below, found its mark. The light on the scoring machine flashed a brilliant, definitive green. The buzzer shrieked, signaling the end of the bout. 5-4. David had won. The crowd exploded. A wave of sound washed over him, a chaotic mix of cheers and applause. He ripped off his mask, his chest heaving, his body slick with sweat. Across the strip, Julian stood frozen, his mask still on, as if he couldn't bear to face the reality of his defeat. He had been beaten. Not by a fluke, not by luck, but by a fencer who had taken his perfect, predictable world and turned it upside down. David looked for his coach and saw him standing in the same spot, his expression unchanged. But as their eyes met across the crowded gymnasium, Coach Du Bois gave him a single, almost imperceptible nod. It wasn't praise. It was an acknowledgement. A confirmation. David had passed the test. He was a fencer. And in the lonely, isolating victory, that single nod was all that mattered. The victory, so monumental in the gymnasium, seemed to shrink in the silence of Coach Du Bois's car on the ride home. The large, gleaming trophy sat on the back seat, a cold, inanimate object that offered no warmth, no companionship. David stared out the window at the passing city lights, feeling the adrenaline drain away, leaving a profound emptiness in its wake. He had done it. He had beaten Julian. He was the Northwood Regional Champion. But the triumph felt strangely hollow, a single note ringing in a vast, empty hall. Du Bois didn't speak for the entire drive, his hands gripping the steering wheel, his eyes fixed on the road. The silence wasn't angry, but it was heavy, freighted with unspoken expectations. When he finally pulled up to David's curb, he simply said, "Monday. 6 a.m. Don't be late." There was no congratulations, no well done. The victory was merely a single step on a much longer, harder path. Returning to the Blackwood Fencing Academy on Monday was like walking into a freezer. The chill was immediate and absolute. Julian was absent, but his presence lingered like a phantom, his defeat having galvanized his followers into a unified front of icy contempt. If David had been a ghost before, he was now a specter they refused to even acknowledge. When he walked past, conversations would cease, heads would turn, and the air would crackle with a hostility so thick he could almost taste it. During sparring rotations, the other boys would pointedly refuse to fence him. "My wrist is sore," one would say. "I need to work on my footwork," another would claim. They created an invisible quarantine around him, leaving him to his solitary drills against the unblinking eye of the mirror. The isolation was a new kind of crucible. He had won the battle, but the war had simply changed tactics. Their silence was a weapon, intended to unnerve him, to make him feel so utterly alone that he would break. But they underestimated the resolve that had been forged in his backyard, in the lonely hours with a French fencing manual. The silence didn't break him, it focused him. The academy became nothing more than a training facility, the other fencers mere obstacles in his peripheral vision. His world shrank to the 60-foot strip, the weight of the foil in his hand, and the relentless pursuit of perfection. Coach Dubois, observing the silent shunning, did nothing to intervene. Instead, he intensified David's training. He handed him a new set of books and grainy videotapes. These weren't about the classical French school he had mastered. They were about the aggressive, powerful style of the Hungarians, the lightning-fast handwork of the Italians. "Your foundation is solid," Dubois stated, his tone as clinical as ever. "Now you will learn to speak other languages with your blade." A one-dimensional fencer is a predictable fencer. Predictable fencers lose. While David was being ostracized within the academy walls, his victory began to create ripples outside of them. A small article appeared in the sports section of the city paper, a human interest story titled, "Scholarship Kid Shocks Fencing Circuit." It painted a dramatic picture of the underdog from the wrong side of the tracks toppling the local champion. The story was picked up by a few sports blogs, the narrative too compelling to ignore. Suddenly, David wasn't just a fencer, he was a story. He was the embodiment of a dream, and people were starting to pay attention. His name, once whispered with contempt in the halls of Blackwood, was now being typed into search engines, discussed in online forums. The culmination of this newfound attention arrived in a crisp, cream-colored envelope addressed to Coach Dubois. It bore the official crest of the National Fencing Federation. The news spread through the academy before David even knew about it himself. The federation, always scouting for fresh talent for the junior national team, had taken notice of the Northwood results. An invitation had been extended for David to attend a week-long intensive training camp at the National Olympic Training Facility. It was a golden ticket, an honor typically bestowed upon the anointed sons of the sport, fencers like Julian. The invitation was the final straw. The day the news broke, Julian returned to the academy. He looked different. The arrogant sneer was gone, replaced by a quiet, unnerving intensity. He had been training, David could tell, his movements leaner, sharper. He cornered David by the lockers, away from the watchful eye of Coach Dubois. His friends, Thomas and the others, stood a few feet back, a silent, menacing chorus. "You must be proud," Julian began, his voice dangerously low. "The papers love you. The Federation loves you. Everyone loves a good charity case." David finished lacing his sneakers, his movements deliberate. "I won the tournament, Julian." "You got lucky," Julian hissed, his control finally cracking. "And now you're stealing my spot. That invitation was supposed to be mine. It's always been mine." "I didn't steal anything," David said, meeting his gaze. "I earned it. On the strip." "You earned nothing," Julian spat, taking a step closer. "You're a novelty. A good story. They don't want you, they want your background. It makes them feel progressive. But you'll never be one of us. You don't have the breeding, the discipline, the history. No matter how many lucky points you score, you'll always be the boy from the gutter playing with a car antenna." The old insult, the one that had once stung him so deeply, now felt hollow. David stood up, his height nearly matching Julian's. The fire was there, that familiar, burning anger, but it was a forge now, not a wildfire. It hardened his resolve, sharpened his words. "You're right," David said, his voice calm and clear, cutting through Julian's rage. "I'm not one of you. I never will be. You were given a foil. I had to build one. You were taught in a polished academy. I learned on cracked concrete. Everything you have was handed to you. Everything I have, I fought for. And I'm going to that camp and I'm going to fight there too." He shouldered his bag and walked away, leaving Julian standing there, speechless, his face a mask of disbelief. David didn't look back. He walked past the other boys, through the silent, hostile academy, and out into the cool afternoon air. The path was lonelier than ever, but for the first time he felt the weight of something more than just his own ambition on his shoulders. He wasn't just a boy from a poor neighborhood anymore. He was a fencer with a national invitation. He was a story. And he was beginning to understand that his fight was no longer just about him. The Olympic Training Center in Colorado Springs was not like Blackwood. Blackwood had been a shrine to a sport. This was a factory. Sprawling and sterile, it was a city dedicated to the forging of champions. There were no polished wood floors or dusty trophies here. There was only the stark functionality of world-class equipment, the faint, omnipresent smell of chlorine from the aquatic center, and the palpable aura of relentless, single-minded ambition. As the shuttle bus passed weightlifters built like mythological gods and gymnasts who seemed to defy gravity, David felt the last vestiges of his regional title's significance evaporate. He was no longer a big fish in a small pond. He was a minnow in an ocean teeming with sharks. The other fencers invited to the junior camp were a different breed from Julian and his cronies. They were the top-ranked athletes from every corner of the country, and they carried themselves with a quiet, unshakable confidence that made Julian's arrogance seem childish. They looked at David not with personal animosity, but with a cool, professional curiosity. They saw his worn-out bag and his ill-fitting warm-up suit, but they were more interested in the way he held himself, the tension in his shoulders, the focus in his eyes. The isolation he felt here was different. It wasn't the bitter cold of social rejection. It was the impersonal void of professional hierarchy. He was an unknown quantity, a wild card, and until he proved himself on the strip he was simply part of the background. The man who presided over this factory was head coach Valery Orlov, a living legend who had coached Soviet champions before defecting to the West. He was a short, barrel-chested man with pale, unblinking eyes and a face that looked like it had been carved from granite. He moved with a surprising lightness, and when he spoke, his voice was a low rumble, his English thick with an accent that clipped his words into sharp, efficient commands. He gathered the fencers on the first morning, his gaze sweeping over them, seeming to catalog every strength and weakness in a single, penetrating glance. "Welcome," Orlov began, his voice devoid of warmth. "You are here because someone thinks you are good. This week you will learn that you are not. You are here to work. If you do not want to work, the airport is that way." He pointed a thick finger towards the door. "There is no room for ego here. Only for sweat. Now warm up." The warm-up was a vision of hell. It was a brutal, hour-long ordeal of plyometrics, sprints, and core exercises that left David's lungs burning and his muscles screaming. It was more intense than any full practice he had ever endured at Blackwood. He struggled to keep up, his body pushed to its absolute limit, acutely aware of Orlov's silent, watchful presence. The true test came during the sparring sessions. Orlov, in his infinite and cruel wisdom, paired David with Marcus Thorne, the #1 ranked junior foilist in the United States. Marcus was everything Julian pretended to be: fluid, fast, and ruthlessly efficient. He moved with the grace of a dancer and the precision of a surgeon. The bout was a massacre. Marcus dismantled him 10-1. The points came so fast David barely had time to register them. It wasn't malicious or angry, it was a clinical, effortless dissection. Every attack David launched was met with an untouchable parry and a riposte that seemed to land before he had even completed his lunge. The humiliation was absolute. His regional championship, the victory that had defined him, felt like a child's drawing next to a masterpiece. After the bout, as David stood gasping for air, his confidence shattered, Orlov approached him. "You have speed," the Russian said, his pale eyes boring into him. "You have heart. You have a fire." The echo of Coach Dubois's words was uncanny. "But your technique has holes. Big holes. Like Swiss cheese. You fight with instinct. Here instinct is not enough. Instinct gets you killed." David braced himself for dismissal, to be told to pack his bags. But Orlov didn't dismiss him. "Your footwork, the coach continued, tapping his own thigh. Powerful, but not efficient. You are a muscle car. You burn too much fuel. You must be a race car. Every movement has a purpose. Nothing is wasted. He then assigned David a series of agonizingly slow, repetitive footwork drills, forcing him to break down every advance, every retreat into its component parts. It was humbling, mind-numbing work. For the rest of the week, David lived in that state of grueling repetition. He was the first to arrive at the gymnasium in the pre-dawn chill and the last to leave late at night, his reflection in the vast mirrors his only companion. He endured the lopsided sparring matches, absorbing every loss not as a defeat, but as a lesson. He was learning to see the geometry of the strip, the subtle shifts in balance, the milliseconds that separated a successful touch from a failed attack. One evening, as he was pushing through his footwork drills long after everyone else had gone to the dorms, Marcus Thorne appeared. He stood watching for a moment, then spoke, his voice quiet. "You're dragging your back foot." He demonstrated, his own movement impossibly smooth. "It's a fraction of a second. But that's all it takes. You give away your timing." He nodded once, then left as quietly as he had arrived. It wasn't an offer of friendship. It was a nod of professional respect, an acknowledgement from the top of the mountain to someone struggling at its base. It was a sign that he belonged here, that his effort was seen. On the final day of the camp, Orloff had him spar Marcus again. He still lost, badly, but the score was 10-4. He was faster, his defense was tighter, and he managed to land 3 more touches than before. It was a small victory, but it was a victory nonetheless. As he packed his bag to leave, feeling both exhausted and exhilarated, Orloff handed him a single sheet of paper. It was a detailed, 6-month training regimen, a personalized roadmap filled with complex drills and conditioning targets. "This is your work," Orloff said. It was the only farewell he offered. David took the paper, its weight far greater than that of his trophy. He had arrived at the camp as a regional champion, proud and naive. He was leaving as a student, humbled and hungry. He had seen the peak of the mountain, and he now understood the vast, intimidating distance he had yet to climb. But for the first time he had a map. And as he walked out of the training center and into the long shadow of the Rockies, he felt no fear. Only a cold, hard and unwavering resolve to begin the ascent. David returned from the mountain a different person. He walked back into the Blackwood Fencing Academy not with the defiant chip on his shoulder of a regional champion, but with the quiet, monastic focus of a pilgrim who had seen a glimpse of the divine and been found wanting. The 6-month training regimen from Coach Orloff was his new holy text, each drill a prayer, each conditioning target a penance. The hostile silence of Julian and his disciples, which had once been a suffocating pressure, was now just background noise, the meaningless chatter of a world he was rapidly leaving behind. His new routine was brutal and relentless. He arrived at the academy before the sun rose, the sky still a bruised purple, and began the punishing warm-ups Orloff had prescribed. He spent hours on drills that were designed to rewire his muscle memory, to transform him from a muscle car into a race car. He worked with weighted foils to build his wrist strength and practiced on a moving target to hone his precision. Coach Dubois watched this transformation from a distance, his hawk-like eyes missing nothing. He never offered a word of praise, but he became a silent facilitator. A new, more advanced targeting system appeared one morning. The supply closet was suddenly stocked with the specific type of grip tape David preferred. Dubois was clearing the path, allowing David to pursue the punishing regimen laid out by the legendary Russian coach. This single-minded dedication began to have an unforeseen effect on the academy's ecosystem. The younger fencers, the ones not yet fully indoctrinated into Julian's cult of personality, started to watch David. They saw him arrive before everyone else and leave long after. They saw the sweat soaking his uniform during drills that made their own practices look like a garden party. They saw the tangible results when, on the rare occasions he sparred, his movements were cleaner, faster, and more decisive than anyone else's. The whispers about him began to change. Contempt was slowly replaced by a grudging, almost fearful, respect. He was becoming a myth within his own gym, the boy who trained with the fury of a man possessed. Julian saw it all, and the sight was like acid in his veins. He saw David's quantum leap in skill, the effortless efficiency that had replaced his raw power. He saw the shifting allegiances in the eyes of the younger boys. His entire identity, which had been built on the bedrock of being Blackwood's finest, was crumbling. His rivalry with David morphed from a simple desire to win into a desperate, all-consuming obsession. He abandoned his classical, polished style and began trying to emulate David's aggressive power, but it was an ill-fitting suit. His fencing became erratic, a discordant clash of his natural grace and a forced, angry aggression. The academy became their silent battleground, two fencers on divergent paths, one climbing towards the light, the other consumed by the shadow. The next few months were a blur of airports, sterile hotel rooms, and the cacophony of national tournaments. David, with Coach Dubois as his stoic guide, began his assault on the national circuit. He was no longer an unknown underdog. His name on a bracket was now a cause for concern. He faced the best junior fencers in the country, the Sharks from the Olympic training camp. He had a brutal quarterfinal bout against Marcus Thorne in Philadelphia that he lost 15-13, a match that left both fencers exhausted and earned him a nod of genuine respect from the nation's number one. He took a bronze medal in a tournament in Chicago, a silver in Dallas. With each result, he accumulated national ranking points, his name climbing the ladder with relentless momentum. He was no longer just a story in the local paper. He was becoming a recurring character in the national fencing narrative. Commentators on the live streams of the finals began to talk about his explosive style, his unorthodox background, and his meteoric rise. They spoke of his unflappable demeanor and his warrior's mentality. He was becoming a symbol, though he was too focused on the next point, the next bout, to fully realize it. The culmination of his 6-month crusade arrived not in the form of a medal, but in another cream-colored envelope from the National Fencing Federation. This one felt heavier. It wasn't an invitation to a camp. It was a formal summons. Based on his national ranking, he was now number 4. He had been selected to compete in the Junior World Cup qualifiers. It was a 3-day tournament that would determine the 4 fencers who would wear the nation's colors and compete on the international stage. The news landed in the Blackwood Academy with the force of a thunderclap. Julian, who had failed to make it past the round of 16 in the last 2 national events, saw his last, desperate hope evaporate. He simply stopped coming to practice. The king had abdicated his throne. That evening, as David was packing his bag, Coach Dubois stopped him. He held out a brand new foil, its silver bell guard gleaming under the fluorescent lights. It was a top-of-the-line model, perfectly balanced, impossibly light. "Orloff's regimen made you a contender," Dubois said, his voice softer than David had ever heard it. "But your own fire, the part of you that fought with a car antenna in a dirt yard, that is what will make you a champion. Do not ever lose it." He paused, looking at the American flag patch on the sleeve of David's uniform. "This is no longer about you and Julian. It is no longer about this academy. When you step on that strip at the qualifiers, you carry more than just your own ambition." David took the foil. He looked down at the flag on his arm, the familiar stars and stripes suddenly seeming foreign, heavy with a significance he had never considered. The path he had walked, from the cracked concrete of his backyard to the polished strips of the national circuit, had not been a solitary journey after all. He was the product of a scholarship, of 2 demanding coaches, of the boys who had scorned him and the opponents who had tested him. He was a story, and that story was about to be woven into the fabric of his country's athletic legacy. For the first time he understood. He wasn't just fighting for himself anymore. He was forging a blade for a nation. The air in the National Fencing Hall in Richmond, Virginia, was different. It was not the sterile, ambitious air of the training center, nor the hostile, privileged air of Blackwood. It was thick with the suffocating weight of consequence. This was the final gate. The 4 fencers who emerged victorious from this 3-day crucible would travel to the Junior World Championships in Budapest. They would wear the American flag not as a patch on a uniform, but as a second skin. David felt that weight in the quiet moments before his first bout. He looked at his reflection in the polished floor, the red, white, and blue on his sleeve a stark, vibrant splash of color against his dark skin. He saw the boy with the car antenna, the ghost in the mirror, the humbled student in the shadow of the Rockies. They were all there, all parts of the weapon he had become. Coach Dubois stood nearby, his face an unreadable mask, but his presence was a steadying anchor in the swirling sea of pressure. The qualifiers were a brutal double-elimination tournament, a format that was as much a test of endurance as it was of skill. David fought with a cold, methodical fury. He was no longer the wild card. He was the number 4 seed, a known threat, and his opponents came at him with carefully crafted strategies. But the fencer they had studied on video was already obsolete. David was constantly evolving, his style a fluid, unpredictable synthesis of the Hungarian power, the Italian speed, and the raw, untamed fire that was uniquely his. He moved through the winner's bracket with grim determination, his new foil feeling like an extension of his own arm. His final match in the winner's bracket was against Marcus Thorne. It was their third meeting, a rivalry that had become a centerpiece of the junior circuit. The bout was a breathtaking display of fencing at its highest level, a physical chess match of feints, parries, and explosive attacks. They were perfectly matched, two sides of the same coin, Marcus the flawless technician, David the brilliant improviser. The score was tied at 14-14. In the final, decisive point, Marcus launched a perfect textbook attack. David, instead of meeting it with a conventional parry, used a move he had never attempted in competition. A risky, spinning maneuver that dodged the attack and scored with a flick to the back. The crowd gasped, then erupted. David had beaten the nation's number 1, securing his spot as one of the final 4. He had qualified for the World Championships. As the referee raised his hand, a wave of emotion so powerful it almost buckled his knees washed over him. He had done it. He looked into the stands and saw a small, familiar group of people who had never been there before. His mother, her face streaked with tears of joy. His neighbors from his block, waving a handmade sign that read David's World. They had driven all night to be here to witness this moment. His victory was not his alone. It was theirs. It was a victory for the cracked concrete, for the hand-me-down clothes, for every kid who had ever been told they didn't belong. But the tournament wasn't over. The final bout for seeding pitted him against an opponent he never expected to see again. From the loser's bracket, having fought his way back with a desperate, almost frightening intensity, emerged Julian. He looked like a ghost. He was thinner, his face pale and drawn, but his eyes burned with a feverish light. He had shed the last of his polished, classical style and now fought with a reckless, almost suicidal aggression. He had clawed his way to this final confrontation, his last chance to reclaim a piece of the glory he felt had been stolen from him. As they stood on the strip for the final match of the tournament, the atmosphere was electric. This was more than a bout for seeding, it was the final, unavoidable collision of two worlds. Engard Pretz alles. Julian came at him with a scream of raw fury, his blade a wild, slashing torrent. This wasn't fencing, it was a street fight with steel. He was trying to overwhelm David, to beat him with the very brute force he had once accused David of possessing. David was forced onto the defensive, giving ground, the sheer ferocity of the assault keeping him off balance. Julian scored the first point, then the second, his roars echoing in the tense silence of the hall. David retreated, his mind racing. He saw the desperation in Julian's eyes, the self-destructive rage. He could meet it with his own fire, turn the bout into a brawl. But as he looked past Julian, he saw the flag on his own sleeve. He saw his mother's face in the crowd. He heard Coach Dubois's voice in his head. You carry more than just your own ambition. You would not be dragged down into the gutter. He would not win on Julian's terms. He would win as himself. He took a deep breath, centered himself, and began to fence. He met Julian's wild aggression not with anger, but with an almost impossible calm. He used his superior footwork to control the distance, making Julian's furious lunges fall short. He used the precise economical parries he had learned from Orloff to deflect the clumsy, powerful blows. He absorbed Julian's rage, redirected it, and turned it against him. He was a matador, and Julian was the raging bull, charging again and again at a cape that was no longer there. David scored a point. Then another. And another. Each touch was clean, precise, and almost gentle. He was dismantling Julian not with force, but with a skill so superior it was almost cruel. The fire in Julian's eyes began to flicker, replaced by a dawning, horrified understanding. He was being beaten, thoroughly and completely, by the very boy he had dismissed as a gutter rat. At 14-7 on the final point, Julian stood defeated, his body heaving, his will broken. He didn't even attack. David advanced, his steps measured and sure. He extended his arm and with a simple, clean thrust, he touched Julian's chest. The green light flashed. The buzzer sounded. It was over. David ripped off his mask, his face impassive. He offered his hand. This time Julian took it. His grip was limp, his eyes, seen through the mesh of his mask, were empty. In that moment, David felt no triumph, no satisfaction. He only felt a profound sense of pity for the boy whose world had been so completely unmade. Later, as he stood on the podium with Marcus and the other two qualifiers, the gold medal for the tournament draped around his neck, the flashes of cameras were like stars. He saw Coach Dubois standing at the back of the hall, and for the first time, there was a faint, unmistakable smile on his face. David held his trophy aloft, not for himself, but for his neighborhood, for his mother, for every person who had ever been on the outside looking in. He was a boy from a poor neighborhood, a fencer who had started with a car antenna. But now he was a champion. He was a source of pride. And as he looked out at the sea of faces, he knew that the weight of the flag on his sleeve was not a burden. It was a privilege. It was his story, and he would carry it with honor to Budapest and beyond. Thank you for listening. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and like the video.